The morning people. Peter wasn't surprised to see him on the train, but the sling and bandages supporting his left arm had come across as a shock. Several different band-aids and strips of surgical tape snaked along the curves of his knuckles to end at his bruised fingers. Their eyes met, and Peter quickly looked out the window, even though it was much too dark to see anything. All he could make out was his own oversized reflection, squinting back at him. There weren't many others on the 1 a.m. train headed south. In fact, Peter was usually the only one. Yet on a rare few occasions another passenger, a man of about his same age, would join him for the ride. They would both get off at the boardwalk, which was the very last stop, and go their separate ways. Now that Peter had just lost his job, this was sure to be their last encounter. He had really come to identify with the man. It didn't matter why he was on the train or where he was going. It was the sheer fact that they were there together at the same time while the rest of the town was asleep. Peter eyed the man again, but was once more caught in the act. This time they made eye contact, and the man's beard twitched before breaking open into a wide grin. While the train was still moving, the man managed to shuffle across the aisle to sit next to Peter. He held out his good hand as they shook. "How are you this morning?" the man asked. "No complaints. I just got off work." "Great. I just got back from the emergency room," he said, patting his sling. "I'm Mark, by the way." Peter meant to introduce himself, but Mark continued. "You're getting off at the boardwalk, right?" he asked. "Why?" "I'll give you $200 if you help me fill a hole," Mark said, pulling 2 paper bills out of his jeans. "As you can see, I can't operate a shovel with this arm. I just injured it tonight." He placed the money into Peter's open hand. Peter closed his hand around the cash, knowing that it was going to be his only income for the upcoming weeks, or months. "What hole? At the beach?" "I think it's best if I show you." Peter's eyebrows crossed, and Mark seemed to read his mind. "It's not what you think. It's just a hole. I found something on the beach which I'd like to keep hidden, that is to say, buried, but it's nothing criminal. I'm just trying to keep something safe, that's all." "Keep what safe?" Peter pressed. Mark got up without an answer and migrated toward the exit. He waited there on the steps, balancing himself on a steel handrail. Peter joined him at the doors and steadied him by lightly touching his back. "How'd you hurt your arm?" "I was bit," he replied, and that was all he had to say on the subject. Peter followed Mark onto the boardwalk, and then onto the beach. He couldn't see the ocean from where he was, but he could hear it break and sigh somewhere over his shoulder. He thought he could even feel the surf's tickle on the nape of his neck, carried on the tails of a soft breeze. When Mark motioned for him to venture underneath the boardwalk and into the shadows, Peter hesitated. "You don't have a body back there, do you?" Mark laughed and shook a flashlight out of his sling. He pointed the beam of light over into the darkness at what appeared to be a grave in the sand. A closer glance revealed that the hole was actually pretty shallow. Peter refused to move any closer, so Mark approached the hole, stooped over, and heaved open a trapdoor. "They're catacombs," Mark said, flashing his light down into the well. "I came across it one day with a metal detector. Imagine this if you can. It's an underground system of tunnels that can open anywhere in the city. You'd be surprised at how many trapdoors there are just like this one. They always seem to open up into some basement or cellar. Every time I come out here I have to dig up the trapdoor and then bury it when I leave. I haven't told anybody about it, but you're an exception. I'm going to have to trust you." Now Peter was standing next to Mark, peering into the dark hole. He could see a small ladder ending at a floor of wet concrete. "No one knows about these tunnels? How can that be?" he asked. "Well, someone knows about them. They only lead to select places in the town, the police station being one of them." "What are they used for?" Mark shrugged. "I'd have to guess drugs, but what do I know?" "Why do you keep burying it?" Mark thought about this. "Probably because I want it to be my secret. I have a selfish need to protect what's mine, and I do feel privileged to know it's here. Can we go down there?" Mark pointed at a shovel leaning up against a beam. "We should really start burying it. It's too dangerous right now." "Dangerous?" Mark's injured arm twitched inside the sling, and he cradled it to his chest. "These tunnels are meant to be a secret. I know now to use extreme caution, because I'm not the only one who goes down there, and the other men that do are even more cautious." Peter nodded that he understood. Mark closed the trapdoor and handed Peter the shovel, who took his time in accepting it. He held the shovel in his hands awkwardly, like it was an alien piece of technology he was not schooled in. And then with one fleeting glimpse at his strange new comrade, Peter dug the spade into the pile of sand and deposited his first scoop onto the trapdoor. Mark set the flashlight down in the sand, the light illuminating the hole as Peter worked, and while Mark enjoyed a cigarette with his back turned, Peter kicked the flashlight into the hole and made it disappear. By the time Mark returned attention, the hole was already buried, and Peter was handing him his shovel. It didn't take long to finish the job, only 5 short minutes and a dozen or so shovelfuls. He patted the sand flat with Mark's instruction, and they shook hands. Mark slung the shovel over his good shoulder. "Maybe next week we can meet up and do some exploring," Mark said as they ducked out from under the boardwalk. They started the short trek up the beach. "I'd like that," Peter said. "Can we meet here, same time tomorrow night?" Mark gave him a sideways glance, and he was smiling. "I don't like secrets. Even when I was a kid I couldn't mind my own business," Peter said. "I'm the same way, and yes, there's something very exciting about these tunnels. I don't blame you there." Up on the boardwalk, Mark stopped to consider. "Maybe it would be a good idea to partner up, 2 heads." He shook Peter's hand a second time. "See you tomorrow." And then he was walking alone up the street, using his shovel as a walking cane. He disappeared under the harsh sheen of the streetlights. Peter did not follow him. He stood in place for a long time, staring out at the ocean, shuffling and reshuffling his thoughts. Yes, there was something exciting about those tunnels, something very exciting. When he saw that Mark was truly gone, he hurried back to the dig site, which he found quite easily thanks to the mass of fresh footprints, and he fell on his knees. He immediately started digging into the sand with his hands, and he soon came across the buried flashlight, still alive with light. He turned it off and continued digging. By the time he was done, his hands were raw and the joints in his arms and shoulders were sore. He grasped the steel handle for the trapdoor and pulled it open, thin tendrils of sand trickling down through his legs and into the darkness. With the flashlight in his pocket, he climbed down the ladder. He took his first look around, at least as far as his flashlight beam could probe. He aimed the light directly in front of him, and he could see that the single tunnel was about to branch out into 2 more, one going left and one going right. The straight way continued at a falling incline, deeper and deeper underneath the city. There were limitless possibilities fanning out in front of him, and he had the light to pinpoint every one. He wanted to go tromping down into the darkness like a lucky excavator stumbling across an Egyptian tomb, but there was also something very uneasy about what he was facing. There was Mark to think about, his injury, and his strict words of warning. Those could not be ignored, at least not while he was on his own. Not until tomorrow would he really get to stretch his legs. As Mark had said, 2 heads. He decided that he would walk forward a little ways. That way he couldn't possibly get lost, and he could get a feeling for how far the tunnels truly stretched. He walked past the fork, picking up his pace as he went. In a matter of minutes he came across another juncture in the tunnel and decided he had come far enough. He turned around and walked straight, but after 10 more minutes of hiking, he still hadn't met up with the trapdoor. 10 minutes turned to 20. The catacombs seemed to exhale and a chilled wind blew past. The air didn't sit above him like a cloud. It enveloped him. It pushed and pulled him. Gradually, the ceiling proved to be too low to stand upright, so he had to walk with his back bent, his hair grazing the concrete. Another strong gust of wind filled his lungs and dried his eyes, and then the breath was suddenly on his back, nudging him on. His breathing was growing harsher and his steps were haphazard and heavy. Even the tunnel was cool. He was sweating and his mouth was going dry. His light went out a few minutes later, and his heart thumped against his ribcage. He screamed for help, all the while trying to shake his flashlight into cooperation. He lost all sensation in his legs, his feet, his pounding head and heart. All he could focus on was the smothering darkness, churning with substance in front of him, and his eyes as they widened remarkably huge in the dark, begging with flooding tears for a sliver of light. In those quick moments of panic, his mind started sputtering with very real images. He pictured Mark on the boardwalk, startled with the realization that he had forgotten his flashlight, and returning to see that the trapdoor had been dug up again. Mark would then come down to rescue him, calling his name and leading him by the hand back out into the night. But no one responded to his calls, and no helpful hands materialized out of the darkness to take his. Then he ran into a wall, and his hands found a ladder. He gratefully climbed it and heaved open a trapdoor. The first thing that hit him was the explosive light, and the second was a pungent odor, which he recognized as wet dog fur. In an instant the dogs were leaping at the inside of a cage, flashing their teeth and barking their protest. There was a man standing in the cage with the dogs, filling up their bowls with a gallon jug of water. He pushed past the animals and furrowed his brow, watching Peter closely. Peter scanned the remaining quarters of the basement and picked out a lone screwdriver lying dormant on the floor, within his reach. "A gopher should never poke his head out of a hole unless he dug it himself," the man said. "The last guy who stumbled in here knows the truth of this." "Just let me leave," Peter compromised. "Let me use your door and I'm gone. I have a better idea. Go back into that hole, and I'll let my dogs come after you." Peter's eyes flashed to the stairs. The man noticed. "I will open this gate, and my dogs will kill you." He looked away for a second to pat one of the two German shepherds on the head, and it made as if to snap at him. In that split second, Peter had snagged the screwdriver and slipped it into his pocket. The man reached for the cage door, and the dogs were already pushing it in, ready for their master to trigger the lock. Peter's hands and feet decided for him. They carried him back down the ladder and a safe distance through the tunnel. He folded into a deep crouch, wielding the stolen screwdriver. He sat there in the darkness and listened, counting every helpless heartbeat. Suddenly, he heard the click of their nails on the concrete. That got him running again, into a dark space without ceilings, walls, or floors. He was at the center of the universe, fleeing from an invisible set of monsters. He wanted nothing more than to chew on his bones amid all that peace and quiet, where even the forgotten breath of the underground would come to taste his insides, just as he had tasted the insides of his city. Further up the tunnel, he saw a hint of light, dwindling and soft, but he wasn't sure if his eyes were playing tricks on him or not. It would glimmer and disappear, bright one second with a pool of light casting across the ceiling, and then only a star the next second, barely visible. He heard the dogs behind him, far away, but they were barking excessively, as though to remind him they were still there. Then the light began to grow brighter, and he knew that it was for real. His feet tangled together, and he was on his stomach. There were legs advancing toward him, and a strong hand fell on his back. Peter reacted with a hellish scream, closely followed by the upward swing of his weapon. There was a crack, and the light went out. The lighter clacked to the concrete, and something much heavier joined it. Peter kicked the lighter in the process of standing upright, and he found it fast. He hurriedly flicked the wheel. The first feature to swim into focus was the handle of Peter's screwdriver, protruding from a thicket of hair, and the second was a sling.